So today we're going to, so this class is basically covering producer theory. It's not covering demand. And sort of the most fundamental topic in producer theory is obviously the supply to the market of goods by firms. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And in particular, we'll discuss three questions. First is, how do firms maximize profits, and various topics related to that, the legal and normative basis of firm profit maximization, how internal conflicts within firms impede profit maximization, and then we'll talk about supply functions, and we won't talk about the basics of supply, deriving it from production functions and costs and so forth, because all that is, I think, a little bit boring. So instead, we're going to talk about the temporal aspects of supply. In particular, how do we understand the notions of short-run versus long-run supply, and the notion of durable versus storable inputs, and Le Chatelier's principle. And then we'll use those to talk about sort of the dynamics of how firms behave without having to use an explicitly dynamic model. And then finally, we'll talk about the source and distribution of profits across firms, their relationship to barriers to entry, and in particular, talent as an important barrier to entry, and its relationship to the distribution of talent in the population, and the notion of Zipf's law. Okay, and we'll probably take a break in one of the breaks between these topics. I'm not sure exactly which one. It depends how time is progressing. Okay, so firms, at least in the United States, and I think the law in Colombia is relatively similar, come in 5 principal varieties, but there are variations on these. So first, there are what are called sole proprietorships. These are in the United States called mom and pop stores. Basically, most of the vendors who sell food around here, most restaurants, small shops that are not chains, are sole proprietorships. Those are basically just people who, in their capacity as citizens, also sell stuff. The second variety are partnerships, which are basically, rather than just being one person selling stuff in their capacity as a person, they're a group of people who get together to sell things. So the most common example of these are professionals. Most doctors are in partnerships, lawyers are in partnerships with each other, accountants, etc. Third form, which is the form that you should probably have in the back of your mind for most of the course, are corporations. So corporations have a very important distinction from partnerships, which is that they have limited liability. What does limited liability mean? Well, it means that if someone incurs a debt or commits a crime that requires them to pay a penalty or something like that, as the corporation, the debts created that way die with the corporation. You can't come after the individual people for those debts. If the corporation can go bankrupt and slough off the debts that it's accumulated in that way. Now, there are 2 different types of corporations. One are privately held corporations, which are held by a small number of individuals and are not traded on public markets. Usually owned by venture capitalists, but also just by any other type of individual. And publicly held corporations are traded on stock markets. Now, the disadvantage that comes with the advantage of having limited liability as a corporation is that you usually have to pay corporation taxes, which disadvantage forming a company as a corporation. Fourth, there are nonprofit firms which don't seem to make profits. They usually don't have to pay taxes, but they also can't take any money from inside the company and disperse them to outside financiers in the form of profits. All money in the company has to stay in the company. Cooperatives, on the other hand, can disperse money outside of the company, but only to people who are consumers or workers at the company. Finally, and this is much less common these days in developed countries, are state-owned enterprises, which are run by the government. Okay, now let's focus on corporations, but this applies more broadly. Is Juan Castillo here? Juan, what are the two primary means of financing businesses or corporations?
From debt and from the capital coming from the company.
Yeah, so those are called debt and equity, and what's the distinction between the two?
That when you have a debt, you have to pay whatever. It doesn't matter how the firm does.
Yeah.
By the equity, you only have to pay if the firm goes well.
Exactly. Exactly right. Yeah, so equity also has tax disadvantages. So usually you have to pay taxes on the money you get back from the debt, equity, but on the on the debt, you can usually deduct the interest from your corporate taxes. So if, in effect, you're only taxed once on that, whereas on the equity, you're effectively taxed twice. And on equity, you often get voting shares to make decisions about what the corporation does, whereas debt usually doesn't have any direct control, except sometimes when you make a loan, you'll have certain requirements that the company has to do certain things if they take on the debt to protect the interests of the debt holders. Okay. There's also some things that are in between the two of these, which are called preferred shares, which don't have voting rights, but have a payoff structure that's more like equity, but not completely, because they'll have sort of first claims if the company starts to go bankrupt over some of the debt holders. Okay. So throughout most of the course, we're going to assume that firms maximize profits. This is a very standard economic assumption. But a natural question is whether this is actually what firms do, or even if it's what they should be doing. So for the moment, I want to assume, and we'll come back to this, that the owners of the corporation do want them to maximize profits. And one reason why typically shareholders would want them to maximize profits is that even if the shareholder wants to achieve some other goal, he can get the firm to maximize profits, get back the money, and then spend that money on whatever goal it is that he wants to achieve. So it makes sense very often to think that shareholders really would want the firm to maximize profits, and then they'll take that money and do with it whatever they want. Now the question is, should shareholders try to accomplish this goal? And the corporate social responsibility advocates say no. Corporations should try to do what's in the interest of the public, at least to some extent, protecting the environment, protecting workers' rights, things like this. Milton Friedman, in his argument, the social responsibility of corporations is to maximize profits, argues very strongly that that's not the case. And Nancy, do you want to tell me a little bit about why Friedman thinks this is the case?
He says like managers are people, so they should maximize profit because they are spending the money of the shareholders.
Yeah.
They are acting as agents, not as principals.
Yeah.
Like person living their life like normal day, they are acting as principal, and in that way they have a social, maybe they have a social responsibility, but not when they are managing a firm.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So he argues that managers are agents. They choose the means to achieve profits rather than the goals that the corporation sets, and that by pursuing the goals, the managers are basically imposing costs on the shareholders. And if there are externalities that should be corrected, that should be done by the state. The goal of you can think of a manager really as being a machine. It's not the job of the machine to undo what the person who's in charge of the machine does. And even if the shareholders want to achieve some social goal, why should they do that in the guise of the corporation? They could do that. They could take the money that they make from the company and then spend that on creating some organization which would be devoted to that. Now, I think most economists are sympathetic to what Friedman says, but I think that there are a couple of exceptions to that rule. So one exception to that rule is that it might be that there's some activity that is socially beneficial that is highly complementary with what the company does, and therefore it's not so easy to remove it from the company. So for example, Bell Corporation, which had a monopoly on telephone service in the United States, had a giant laboratory which did very important research. And I think a lot of people argued that that sort of research was so complementary with Bell's other expertise that it would have been hard to have that just be funded by profits coming from Bell and be run completely separately. And second, some executives may actually be willing to accept lower pay in exchange for the company doing socially beneficial things, in which case effectively it's the executive rather than the company that's paying for the costs of that. Now, some people have argued against the shareholder value view with a less extreme position than the corporate social responsibility view, which says that you need to think about the environment and all these sort of things that are really externalities, that are really separate from what the company cares about. Instead, they've said that there are some stakeholders that are associated with the company other than the shareholders whose value we need to protect. In particular, the value to the workers of the company and the value to the consumers of the company's products. And this quote-unquote stakeholder society view argues that firms, rather than just viewing their shareholders as the only people they're responsible to, should also take into account their other stakeholders like workers and consumers. Now, most, or maybe many, but probably most economists are skeptical even of this more narrow view. And the reason is that there's a fundamental difference between a shareholder and a worker or a consumer. So for most companies, if you do a bad job serving your customers, the customers can go buy a different product. And if you treat your workers badly, they can probably go work at a different firm. Now, that's not always true, and that's not completely true, but to a large extent, that's true. There's a fundamental difference with a shareholder, which is that the shareholder puts his money in. And once his money's in, he's totally useless to the company. His money is sunk in there, and they can go steal from, they can do whatever they want. If there aren't protections, normative and legal protections of the shareholders, the shareholder can be completely expropriated by the company. But in knowledge that the shareholder will be completely expropriated, no one will ever give money to create companies, except to people maybe who are in their family or who are their friends or to themselves. And so if you live in a society where there aren't enough protections of shareholders, you can get into really bad trouble where no one wants to give money to create companies except to people who are in their family or who are their friends. So if you think about why many Latin American countries or other even less developed countries have such nepotistic relationships where there's a few families that control so much of the economy, the reason is that those families that would have so much money, maybe in the United States, would give their money to a bank, and that bank would lend it out to lots of people, or they would give it to a venture capital fund, and those would lend it out, give it to create lots of different businesses. But if you don't have a strong culture and strong legal protections that keep people from being stolen from by the companies that they invest in, people don't want to give it to anyone other than someone that they can trust personally, right? So actually, despite the fact that shareholder value ideas sound very harsh, and they don't care about the workers, they don't care about the et cetera, there's actually a huge amount of value to that if you want to have a society where people can meritocratically gain access to funding from people who are afraid that they might steal the money. So I think that there's most economists think that there's a lot of value in having corporate law and corporate values that say you have to be responsible to your shareholders, because that's what makes it possible to finance companies that are not being created by people who are friends or family of the person who has the capital. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't have redistribution to favor the workers, or that there aren't inefficiencies that come from just maximizing profits. And in fact, we'll talk about a lot of those inefficiencies throughout the course. But I think many economists fear that the inefficiencies that would come from just a breakdown in the ability to supply capital to people who have valuable projects to undertake is much greater than the inefficiencies that come from the distortions of profit maximization. Okay. So, what do we mean by maximizing profits? Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I was thinking of the case when social
Yep.
responsibility becomes part of the way that the company gets its goals,
Yeah.
its economic goals.
Yeah.
You know, like in the marketing part, when they use this green labels and all this
Yeah.
stuff that are more for selling more at better prices.
Yeah.
And there are also
Yeah.
social responsibility. That's
Yeah,
a
so
special case.
does anyone remember what Friedman says about that?
I don't
He has a very nice discussion of it, actually. So he says that that's fine if it helps you to maximize profit, but in the end, it's sort of dishonest. And that a company should do it because it's their responsibility to their shareholders to do it, but that he thinks if you were going to take any social responsibility into account, it would be not to try to deceive your customers by that sort of thing, because almost always it's a very cynical ploy. The company is much worse than other companies would be at actually achieving those social goals. It would be much better to let the consumers keep the extra 50 cents and donate it to charity than it would be to have this product which allegedly has all these social values, but it's really just a way of charging more money to the consumer. So I think a good example of that is there's a big debate over fair trade coffee. And there's pros and cons and so forth of fair trade coffee, but the reality is that relative to other things you could do with the extra money you pay for fair trade, it's a very, very bad way to get money to the people in those countries. I mean, I don't think anyone would say that it's an efficient way of delivering money to those people. So, yeah. Okay, so the naive definition of profits that most people think of is it's like how much stuff we sell times the price we sell it at minus the cost. In reality, and in fact, throughout a lot of the course, that's sort of the definition we're going to be using. In reality, things get a lot more complicated. Because first of all, economic profits and accounting profits are not the same thing. And we really need to think about economic profits when we maximize profits, not just simple accounting profits. So for example, if a proprietor of a shop, like a mom and pop store, works at that store, P times Q minus C is still the right formula if you include in C the cost to him of not doing all the other things that he could do with his time. Because usually he's not literally paying himself a wage. So you have to take into account the full opportunity cost, not just the total profit in an accounting sense. And another distinction is that if you think about a company, they could easily expand the total amount of profits they're making if they issue a bunch more stock that gives them money that they can use to then go invest and make more profits. But that doesn't actually raise the profits per current shareholder. When they issue those shares, that's a cost to the company that's being paid by the current shareholders, right? Because they now have to make whatever profits they make in the future go to the other shareholders as well as the original shareholders. So really the value that matters is the value per current shareholder, not the total profits that that company generates on paper. Okay. A second problem arises with regards to time and discounting. So profits tomorrow are not worth nearly as much as profits today are because of the discounting of the future. But in addition, there's lots of things that may be valuable today or even maybe boost the share price today, but that are not actually going to maximize the long-run value of the company. So you have to take a careful view about how you trade off time. You shouldn't say that profits at any time are equally valuable to profits today, but also you shouldn't act as if profits that the immediate profits represent the profits in the long term of the company. And an even bigger problem arises with uncertainty. So if there's uncertainty, the best that a firm can do is maximize its expected profits. But even that isn't really the right way to approach things, because you have to think about the attitudes that the shareholders have to risk. Because in the end, the shareholders are holding the company, and it's got an uncertain profit, and money might be more valuable to those shareholders in certain situations than in others. So for example, if a company is going to be a war profiteer, so they're going to be really good at making lots of weapons that will only be valuable if the company, if we get into a terrible war that's destroying the world. Well, that might actually be a very valuable company for people to invest in, because they'll make lots of money in a situation where money is going to be very scarce, because lots of things are going to be blowing up and people are going to need lots of money, right? So the typical solution to this comes as the stock market value of a company, because that's supposed to take into account the market's value of all the uncertainty and all the different things that could go on. But there's lots of problems with stock market value. So first of all, if you're a privately held company, there is no stock market value. So then what are you supposed to be maximizing? And second, there's a big issue about whether stock markets really do a good job reflecting the long-term value of a company. Often they can be driven, or at least a lot of people think they can be driven, by sort of very short-term crazes and whatever is the popular thing that day. So it's not obvious that that really does a great job of reflecting the long-term value of a company. So in most of the situations we're going to talk about during this course, these problems are not going to play a very big role, but they're important things to keep in mind in the future. Okay. Another big problem can arise from the fact that not all shareholders may agree on what the company should be doing. So one thing is that the shareholders may have, some shareholders may want the company to maximize profits, but some shareholders might have these social values that they care about. And in fact, I don't know if anyone's ever invested in one, but there are these socially responsible investment funds which only put money into companies that are doing things that are socially valuable. A common response, as I mentioned earlier, is that the shareholders should still have the company maximize profit and then should just take their money out and use that on the social goals that they have. But that's not the attitude that everyone takes to investing. And so there's a real issue there of what should you do if some of your shareholders want these social goals, some want profits. Another major problem can arise when shareholders have different attitudes towards risk. And Eugenio, is Eugenio here? Eugenio Merlano? No? Well, I said that there's this problem of maximizing the return given that there's the risk faced by customers, right? That money may be more valuable in situations where the economy is doing worse than it is in a situation where the economy is doing well. And that, how much you should think about that depends on the attitudes that your shareholders have towards risk. Some of them may be more risk averse, some of them may be more risk seeking. Some of them may have certain risks that they face in their life, like they might work for a steel company and be afraid that they might get unemployed and therefore want to be hedged against the risk of the steel industry doing poorly. And some of them might be purchasers of steel who really, or work in steel in a different country that might be competing with the United States, for example, right? So different shareholders will face different risks, and the company needs to try to maximize the profits, taking into account all those risks, and have to trade off the different preferences of different shareholders. Even worse problems arise when there's different types of shareholders. So not all shares of the company are the same, and different shareholders, like the preferred shareholders, might have different interests than the common shareholders, because they get the final claims if the company goes bankrupt. And so they might care more about the company trying to not take too much risk so that there will be something left if the company ends up going bankrupt. Perhaps the biggest problem comes when there are a few large shareholders of the company. And Nancy, why might that be a problem? So imagine that the company has, a few shareholders who control almost all the company, and then, a bunch of other people who have a small part of the company. Why might that lead to a conflict among the shareholders?
I mean, they can concentrate all the decisions in favor of their interests.
So what would be a really egregious example of them doing that?
Maybe
Decisions regarding voting.
Nancy, do you have any idea of a good, like,
maybe they decide about a project, a specific project that is just because of the interest in some sector, and maybe that decision is not the best for the company or for the minority shareholder.
yeah, so a particularly extreme example of this, and this happened in Eastern Europe a lot after the fall of communism, is you had these dominant blocks of shareholders. There were no protection for the minority shareholders. And what the company would do is sell all the assets of the company for 1 cent to another company that was controlled only by the people who had the majority. So they basically would just steal all the money from the people who had the minority, right? So that's a particularly extreme example of what can happen because of conflicts among different types of shareholders. So some imperfect solutions to these types of problems are voting. Now, voting is not really going to solve the minority shareholder problem, right? Because the minority will still get screwed. But at least it can try to adjudicate a little bit between the different interests of the different shareholders. Another possibility is what's called a buyout, which is that if you have the possibility that one individual can always come and buy the whole company, that forces the managers to try to keep the value high enough so that someone won't come and replace them as manager. But again, those are imperfect solutions. There's also lots of laws about protecting minority shareholders that can also help to deal with these conflicts. But probably a more important conflict than a conflict among the different shareholders is the conflict between the shareholders and the people who actually manage the company. In particular, managers often have an incentive to act in their own interests rather than in the interests of the company. And they employ managers at a lower level who act in the interests of those lower level managers rather than the interests of the company as a whole. So I don't know if anyone's ever heard the story about, the woman who goes to a great sage and she asks him, the earth, how does it stay where it is? Why doesn't it fall down? And she says to him, well, it's standing on top of a turtle, right? And then he says, well, but what's the turtle standing on top of? It's like, well, the turtle is standing on top of 2 other turtles. And then he says, well, what are those turtles standing up on top of? And they said, well, it's turtles all the way down, lady, right? So that's sort of the way that companies are, right? You've got managers who are not acting in the interests of the shareholders, and then they're hiring managers who are not acting in the interests of the managers or the shareholders. And companies are made up of these hierarchies of people, each of whom is self-interested and not necessarily acting in the interests of the shareholders. And that's the fundamental problem of that's fundamentally the problem of corporate governance. Now, the ideal situation would be if a manager of the corporation also owned the corporation at the same time from the perspective of incentives. Pablo, why is that the case?
Because he would like to improve if the company gets better, he would be better.
Yeah. Yeah, so you have no conflict of interest, right, if the manager of the company is also the owner. But this is usually impossible because of what I was describing earlier, which is the separation of talent and capital. If it was true that everyone in the economy had exactly the amount of money that matched the projects that they were talented at trying to implement, there would be no problem here. Everyone could just run their own companies. But very often, the people who have talent are different from the people who have money, right? And we need a financial sector to put together the money from the people who have money with the talent from the people who have talent, right? And even if people who had money were also the people who had talent, they might not want to completely supply all the money for their own project because they could lose their life savings because they almost certainly have some risk associated with it, right? And as a result, people are going to have to seek out money from others. Now, one way you could get money from others is you could say, look, I'm going to take your money, but look, if things go badly with the company, I'll just pay all the difference. Now, that doesn't really work if you don't have money, right? Because there's only so much you can pay. But hell, why don't we just have that, you know, if something goes really wrong, I'll torture you, or I'll make you a slave for the rest of your life, and that will force you to act in my interest. Now, we don't think that it's so good to have slavery. And in fact, it used to be that, you know, before the modern times, that there was something called a debtors prison, where you would go and do that. If you did a bad job with someone's money, they could send you to jail, or they could make you a slave. And in fact, many societies had that. Now, those may have been bad institutions in some ways, but if you think that those societies didn't have decent protections of shareholders and so forth, there may have been no other way for them to give people enough incentives. And the alternatives might have been just having the money within the family or having these institutions. So before you go and judge those institutions too harshly, you should think about the economic role they played in the time that they existed, because they didn't have the modern institutions of monitoring managers and so forth. So, and in fact, as I mentioned before, in countries where there aren't institutions like that, and there also aren't developed capital markets, you can end up with incredible amounts of nepotism and very narrowly, controlled wealth. And that's not necessarily that much better than the slavery alternative. So before you too easily accept the institutions that we're used to aspiring to, you should think about what the economic conditions were that led to those institutions and what the real trade-offs are there. This is a very general problem in economics, this problem of providing the right incentives. In fact, it's one of the most recurring problems in economics. And today, I'm going to try to give a little bit of a warm-up of that by thinking about this relationship between the shareholders or suppliers of capital and the managers. OK. So there are tons of different types of incentives that are used by shareholders or by managers to give incentives to the people who work for them. And some of these are the traditional things that economists think of, and some of them are very different things than traditional things economists think of. And I want to go through some of those. But first, I want to ask Camilo, could you give me just some examples of types of incentives that you think are very commonly used in enterprises? And they don't need to be the standard things that economists think about, but they can be if you want to. Yeah. That's a very common one. How about other things? Can you think of other things that are given?
Like bonus at the end of the period, an extra salary.
Yeah, bonus. Yeah, exactly. Anyone else can think of incentives that are used in? Go ahead.
Reputation?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can say that someone did a terrible job at the company and then they'll never get a job again somewhere else, right? So that can be very important. So you started, Camilo, with the most standard economic story. You're moving a little bit more towards something that's slightly less economic, but still very economic. What's your name, sorry? Sebastian.
And loyalty?
So what do you mean by that?
There was like something in the reading about loyalty, about the laws of, if you're working for a company, so you have to be loyal to the company. And they may score you.
Yeah, so maybe you can inspire loyalty to a company by telling people about the great traditions of the company, about how important the company is. You try to get someone who's been with the company for many years and has developed this sense of self that's related to the company. Anyone else want to give examples?
Lawsuits or enforcement?
Yeah, you could sue the company for not doing their duty. So that's another possibility. Any other thoughts?
Which is that increase with like performance?
Well, that's sort of like bonus, like Camilo was saying. Yeah, so concerns about losing your job. So what? Well, that's what Camilo said, yeah. So equity, stock options, other financial instruments, vesting in deferred or contingent compensation. This is a little bit like, you know, the lawsuit type of a thing that like you could take away what the person earned. And that can include personal liability for things that the company did wrong or clawing back compensation. Another thing that you can do is you can just directly monitor the person. And if they do something wrong, you can fire them, like we were saying. Lawsuits, audits. Another thing is efficiency wages. This is related to the firing thing. So you can pay someone more than what they're worth just so that they're afraid of losing their job, right? If you pay someone very little, then they say, oh, screw it, I can go find a job somewhere else, so I don't care if I lose my job. Another thing you can do is you can pay someone much more than they're really worth so that they're afraid that they'll lose their job. Bonuses can be based on hard information, like you met the sale performance, but they could also be based on soft information. I'm your manager and I feel like you did a good job, right? There's the reputational and external career concerns. Like, you know, you might care that you don't be perceived as a bad person because otherwise you won't get a job somewhere else, or otherwise maybe you won't be able to marry someone because they'll think you have a bad reputation, or you know, there can be other social reasons you care about reputation. Loyalty, professionalism, identity in a corporate culture is another very powerful thing that affects the choices that people make. People spend a long time working at a company, spend a long time working at a university, and you care about the future of that university, right? You care, your sense of what makes your life valuable comes to be associated with that company. So let me tell a little story about that. There's a great book by Leo Tolstoy called The Resurrection. Has anyone ever read The Resurrection by Tolstoy? No? Tolstoy? So Tolstoy tells the story of this prostitute. And he says that this prostitute has come up with this whole ideology and view of the world under which everything is about sex. So, you know, we might think that we're fighting nation against nation for the importance of France or the importance of Colombia or whatever, but in reality, it's just that the guy at the top wants to get laid or something like that, right? And the reason she's come up with this ideology, she hasn't read Freud or anything like that who would say something similar. The reason she came up with this ideology is that if you have that view of the world, she's not some lowly prostitute. She's really the most powerful person in the world. And everything else is really just, you know, deception, right? And he says, you go to a jail and you meet a murderer, and you'd think he'd be ashamed of what he's done, right? But in reality, you know, he's proud that he can kill someone and not feel any remorse. And you go to a thief, and he's proud of how good he is with all the locks, right? And you wonder, you know, isn't that terrible? But then you think about it, and you think of the general who's killed so many people in battle. And he doesn't feel any shame for all the people who've died in the battle. He's proud of all of his accomplishments. And you see the politician, and he's proud of all the power he has over other people. Or the rich man, and you know, who knows how he got his money or how his ancestors got the money. But he's proud of the money that he has, right? And what you realize is that everyone has to tell a story about their lives in which they're a very important person, right? And if you can get someone to tell a story about their lives in which what matters is the company and the contribution they make to the company, that can be a very powerful incentive to them, right? Another thing can be sort of leadership or emotions or pressure that people put on you. So a great leader like Steve Jobs can inspire people to think that they don't want to disappoint this person who they admire, right? That can be a very powerful incentive. Or people in your work can put pressure on you. And you might think, oh, that's just, well, I'll get to that in 1 second, sorry. Okay, so another thing is just intrinsic motivation. If people really like the sort of work that they're doing, if they feel passionate about it, they can contribute a lot to that. And that's a very important incentive in Google. So Google gives people 20% of their time every week to just be creative. even if it doesn't serve anything for the company, right? Because they think that the people who they select to go there are the people who like doing that sort of thing. And we do that in research as well. We have people get to tenure. We make sure that they're the sort of person who likes doing research. And then we just let them do their thing. Because they value that freedom. They value that mission. It makes their life important. And so giving them that freedom can be a very powerful incentive. And that works in a lot of open source software as well. And actually, one of the most important things are various forms of reciprocity, family ties, teamwork, et cetera. And you might think those things sound very fluffy, but if you think about the whole organization of the military, it's all based around that idea. The basic idea in the military is not to teach people to love their country. It's to teach people to love the people that they're in their unit with. You have them do so many things together that they can't imagine living when the person in their unit dies. And that's one of the most important sources of heroism, one of the most important incentives that's given. And in corporations, that's a very important incentive too. You get people together, you get them to feel part of a team, and they don't want to let down the other people on their team. So, we went from the most economic, money type incentives down to the things that you think would be most ushy and gushy, right? And don't sound like economics. But all of them are very important incentives to provide people in organizations, and there are very real trade-offs between these different incentives. So for example, this teamwork thing is used a lot in the military, but it actually could be harmful in some corporations because it can lead a group to conspire to help each other rather than to help the company. And that very often happens. So all of these have trade-offs. It's not that these ushy-gushy things are free lunches. They're incentives that have benefits and costs, just like all other incentives have benefits and costs. And I want to go through some of those benefits and costs of different types of incentives. OK, so what's one problem that incentives that we give to people in company tries to solve? One is embezzlement, right? And this is actually much more common than you think. In fact, there was some calculations that were done that the primary reason why credit cards are used have to do with the fact that people at restaurants would otherwise steal from the cash register if there was a lot of cash sitting around there. Or you'd have to have lots of security cameras monitoring them. So this is actually a big problem, and it's an even bigger problem in developing countries. Like, I don't know how big of a problem it is in Colombia, but in many countries, like this is a huge, huge problem that makes it very hard to run stores, that people can be stealing all the time from the store. Another thing is just not working hard. So the most simple example of this is just blatantly slacking off, doing your emails or something like that rather than doing the work that you're supposed to do. But it can also be not focusing on the task at hand, letting your mind wander, not preparing outside work. Another one is to take too much risk for the company because this is a big problem at banks because there's this implicit guarantee and because people at the banks usually don't lose as much money when the company does poorly as they gain when it does well, they can take on too much risk. But in other cases, people may be too risk averse because it may be that they don't get anything on the upside, but they lose their job if something goes badly, right? So you can end up with wrong incentives on both sides of this spectrum, and difference of the types of incentives we talked about before will incentivize people to take more or less risk. Similar issue is whether people are too short-term. If people don't have to deal with the long-term consequences of what they do to the company, and they just leave and peace out and the company goes to hell, that can be another big problem. Now, there are some other, these are some of the most traditional incentives problems that economists talk about, but there's some other ones that have been of a lot of interest recently, but are less well known. And I realize that I would like to have markers right now, and I don't. Does anyone have a marker?
I got two here.
OK, great. So many managers seek to make, for a variety of different reasons, their companies really, really big, right? Why do they do that? Because one reason they might want to make their company really big is that it helps them get a good reputation, right? If they've run a giant company and they didn't totally screw up, they might be able to get some great job after that, even if that harms the company. So the company might have less profits per shareholder, but it might be really, really big, right? And that's not in the interest of the shareholder, but it's often in the interest of the manager. So one very common thing that you see is that executives will try to go on a buying spree, buying up all sorts of other companies. That doesn't actually make them more profits, but it can be beneficial to their reputation. Or if they're managing a big company, they might get paid a lot just because, you know, at that point when there's a giant company, you can sort of hold it hostage. Say, pay me a lot or I'll take all the special things I know about how to run the company and leave, right? And many studies have found that most mergers are wasteful, probably because of these problems. So, you know, what incentives will work well against empire building? Well, remember that we talked about some of these ushy-gushy incentives, and I told you they're not all so great. Think about leadership. Is that good for, you know, you have someone who's a big leader, who has a big view of themselves, et cetera? That might be good for getting people to work for them, not so good for stopping them from building a giant empire in a wasteful way. You know, similarly, the notions of identity and professionalism might actually lead people to think, oh, I have this vision for what the great goals of the company are, which might not just be the profits of the shareholders, right? It might be something much more grandiose. On the other hand, equity shares, the traditional financial incentives, might be very good in that way because it links your interest to the interests of the shareholders in maximizing the profits of the firm, right? Another example, which will go the opposite way, where you might want the softer incentives and not the hard incentives, is when there are some outcomes that are easier to measure than others are, right? So it might be really easy to measure the sales that you make, but it might be really hard to measure whether you give your consumers good information about it. If you don't give them good information and you make a lot of sales, you might sell it to a lot of people in a really dishonest way, right? And that might not actually be so good for the company because in the long term, no one's going to want to buy from that company, right? Another example of this that I think was very prominent in Colombia, I don't know if anyone remembers these scandals where they used to pay people for every gorilla that you killed, right? And so what they would do is they would go out and kill a bunch of innocent villagers, dress them up as gorillas, and say that they'd killed a lot of gorillas, right? So that was not such a great incentive because you could measure how many bodies you brought back, but you couldn't measure whether they were actually, you know, the bad guy or not, right? So in that situation, it might be really bad to give too much incentives for things that are measurable because it leads people along non-measurable dimensions to do all sorts of bad things. And that's sort of what's captured in the notion of hecho la ley, hecho la trampa, right? It's like you make a rule that tries to get people to do something, but then they find a way to you know, satisfy the rule technically, but not satisfy the spirit of the rule. And for those types of reasons, all the incentives that I said were bad for empire building are pretty good, right? If you have a notion of professionalism and what, you know, is the goal of the company and you want to be a great leader, you're going to try to do things that are, you know, not just satisfying the technical things, but satisfying some broader vision of what's right. So you see that there's real trade-offs between these different types of incentives. And you have to try to balance them depending on the types of situations that are faced. Another example of this is overstaying their welcome. So managers will often try to make themselves choose projects or things to do which make them very important. You know, they'll choose to, like, for example, if you are a general and you're running the country, if you're Alvaro Uribe, right, you might actually not want all the violence to end because people know that you're really good at dealing with the violence, maybe not so good at dealing with the economy, right? So if there's lots of violence, you're very valuable, right, to the country. And so you might actually not have an incentive to solve all the problems, or you might have an incentive to get involved with the war because no one's going to want to throw you out of office in the middle of a war if you're a good military leader, right? And so again, some incentives will be beneficial for that. For example, there's something called the golden parachute, where when you leave the company, you get a giant payoff, right? And a lot of people think that's terrible. It's like you screwed up, and now you get a giant payoff to leave the company. But if you don't have that, then you're going to have a big incentive to try to keep yourself around so you can keep earning your paycheck. So there's real trade-offs in all of these types of incentives. Okay. So the incentives that people have are very much impacted by the way in which the company is financed. And when Miguel goes over a problem set, he'll talk a little bit about how the way in which you're financed interacts with the incentives that you have. But let's think about just a few of these possibilities. So one way that the company can be financed is by personal capital, just the money that you have. And Oscar Solis? Is Oscar here? Oscar Solis? No? Well, so we talked about the advantages of personal capital are that you have sort of all the right incentives, but the disadvantage is that you have to fund it all yourself and you take a huge risk with your livelihood, right? Another way you can finance it is by friends and family, which is very common in the early stages of a startup. You get money from your friends or from family members. You say, I've got this great idea. Can you give me a bit of money? And you get some control over the company. What do you think are the advantages of being financed by friends or family? Roman.
The benefits are that you have a commitment with them.
Yeah.
And some of the disadvantages are that maybe you are going to fight with them if there is a problem.
That's a good reason. Another good reason is there might not be that much money among all your friends and family, right? So you might not be able to do very ambitious things with your business using that, right? So, but yeah, that's right. Venture capital is another common form of financing. And one benefit of venture capital over just raising money from the public equity markets is that venture capitalists are usually experts on the particular area. So they can know more what you're doing, they can keep track of it, they can understand your project, know if it's good or not. And they often end up replacing the manager of the company. So that might be a downside for you if you benefit, if you prefer to run your company. The venture capitalist might come in and actually put someone else in, take your idea, give you some money, but then put someone else in your place. So that can be an advantage. It can help you make more money because if you're not actually the right person to be running it, they might know that better. It can have a disadvantage that you don't get to run your company. It also might be that they don't have nearly as much money as the public equity markets will have. So they'll give you a couple $1 million, but not a lot more than that. Another type of financing is debt. And Danielle, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of financing a company through debt?
One of the main advantages, I believe, is that you keep the control of your own enterprise. So,
That's an advantage, yeah.
and yes, a disadvantage is maybe that the rate of interest might be too high, and your idea might not be as...
Well, but versus other forms of financing, you're always going to have to pay whatever sort of the equilibrium rate is. So the question is, what are the social efficiency benefits and disadvantages of debt?
that you might run away with money, and not actually.
Yeah, so debt can have a problem that people might take the money and run. Yeah, go ahead.
I would say that the risk is that the risk gets much higher for the person who runs the company when they get debt.
Yeah, that's a big problem, right? So if they don't do so well, they get completely wiped out. Another disadvantage is that you might have an incentive given that to take a lot of risk. Why would you take a lot of risk? Well, at some point, you're going to be wiped out anyways. Imagine you're not doing so well. The company's not in such hot shape. Then you might take a really, really big risk saying, well, look, if on the downside, the debt holder gets it all. On the upside, I finally have a life again, right? And so you don't have a real incentive to make sure that you don't take on too much risk. So those are some of the advantages and disadvantages of debt financing. And there are different ways that you can finance debt. So you can go to a bank to get financing for your debt. You can get a loan from a bank, or you can float bonds on a market. Now, Oscar Serrano? Yeah. What do you think are some of the benefits and costs of bank debt versus having debt on an open market?
Yes, the term that it can be really negotiate easier with the bank
Yeah, absolutely.
than with bonds because they are fixed.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's advantages and disadvantages of that, right? Because one good thing about the fact that you can't renegotiate is that when you float a bond, people know that you're going to work hard to make sure that you don't get into bad shape because you can't renegotiate and you're going to be stuck with them coming after you with lawsuits. But on the other hand, if something bad happens and it's not your fault, it's much easier to negotiate with the bank to try to solve that problem, right? So that's right. How about public equity? Oscar Quiroga? Is it Oscar Quiroga? Yeah. Oscar, what do you think some of the benefits and costs of public equity are? Compared to these other forms of financing? No? Anyone else have thoughts? Yeah. What's your name? Anna.
Since it's a large crowd, there's more opportunity to get a lot of money.
Yeah.
But you have, since it's public, you have to give a lot of your information to the public.
Well, that's definitely a disadvantage. Can you think of other disadvantages related to things we're talking about? Well, one, yeah, go ahead. That you're.
When you're doing bad work, so some big company can buy.
Well, I think that's kind of an advantage in some ways, right? Because it keeps the managers honest, right? But what's a disadvantage?
Because you lose control of your.
Well, maybe, but that's really for the manager rather than for society as a whole. What do you think, Nancy?
You are the last one in the James, you are equity holder, shareholder.
Well, but the question is, what would make the company not do the efficient thing if there's public holding? Yeah.
I think people are like dispersed.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah.
And then it is like difficult for them to negotiate.
Yeah, well, that's one problem, but even a worse problem is just there's nobody watching what the company's doing, right? If all of us, I mean, can any of you guys even tell me the name of one company that you have stock in? I mean, you probably have some, I mean, I don't know how many of you have an investment portfolio, but probably a lot of you have a little bit of money in some index fund. You probably don't even know the names of any of the companies. So who's making sure that the company isn't just stealing all your money, right? It's really hard to do that, right? Okay, so let's take a 5-minute break now, and we'll take another 5-minute break before we go into the next unit. Now we're going to start talking about supply and time.